go. There we go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program here for Monday, January 23rd. Happy New Year. Happy Lunar New Year to you as well. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We have quite a few people registered for this presentation, so we're going to give them a few minutes to come in from the waiting room. So just sit back, relax, and we will be starting in a moment. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. If you've just joined us from the waiting room, welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program here for Monday, January 23rd. We are going to be starting in just a moment or so. So you are in the right place if you're here for the book club program titled The Quran in English. Sit back, relax, and we're going to be starting in just a moment. Thanks. Okay, it's a few minutes past the top of the hour, and I think we're going to get started here. Hope we can let other folks join us in progress for this program. So good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program for Monday, January 23rd. It's titled The Quran in English, From Yusuf Ali to Sandow Birk, a live online presentation by Bruce Bennett Lawrence. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and host this webinar. Tonight, as I mentioned earlier, we have about 120 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who may be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that's dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without your support. So I encourage you to visit us online. Our website is bccbooks.org, and you can join or donate to the book club there. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled The Quran in English, From Yusuf Ali to Sandow Birk, a live online presentation by Bruce Bennett Lawrence. A graduate of Princeton University in Oriental Studies and History, and having earned a PhD from Yale University in History of Religions, specializing in Islam and Hinduism, Bruce Bennett Lawrence taught at Duke University for over 4 decades. Since 2011, he has been the Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Distinguished Professor of Islamic Studies, Emeritus at Duke, and also adjunct professor at Alliance of Civilizations Institute in Ibn Haldun University, Istanbul. I'm sure I did not say that correctly.
That's okay.
Thanks, Bruce. He's the founding director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center, has been a visiting professor at Dartmouth, University of Chicago, Exeter, and many others. As a Carnegie Scholar of Islam, he did research in Egypt, Ethiopia, and the southern Philippines, as well as Indonesia. Now, his research interests include Afro-Asian Sufism, Islam in world history, contemporary Islam as religious ideology, and the Quran across time and space. Among his recent books are the Bruce B. Lawrence Reader, the Quran in English, and Who is Allah? Several of his books and articles have been translated into numerous languages, including Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and Turkish. Now, for millions of Muslims, the Quran is sacred only in the original Arabic. At once lyrical and adamantine, it resists translation into other languages. Yet scholars have tried to cross this barrier, rendering it into numerous classical and modern languages, including English. Now, the most adventuresome 20th century translator, Yusuf Ali, a British civil servant in India, even strove to make English itself an Islamic language, while a recent American voyager, at once a surfer and artist, Sandow Birk, created an American Qur'an in the 21st century post 9/11. Now, tonight, Bruce Bennett Lawrence will connect to many translators, but he especially prizes the link between Yusuf Ali and Sandow Birk, and that's what he's going to be focusing on this evening. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and I can curate those questions from the chat and the Q&A. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. This is Bruce Bennett Lawrence. It's all yours, Bruce.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you everybody for attending. I'm sorry I can't be in person and have this on the web as well, but I'm really grateful for the possibility that I can do this with so many people in different parts of the world. But I especially want to thank Bo Reedon. If he's there, he'll hear this. If he doesn't, he'll see it and hear it later. But without my connection to Bo, which goes back actually before Princeton to Exeter, we were both classmates at Phillips Exeter Academy, that little place up in New Hampshire. And then we were classmates at this bigger place in New Jersey called Princeton. But we really became friends later in life. And it's thanks to Bo and many conversations and suggestions that he's had that I'm part of this book club of California. So I want to thank Bo, as well as Kevin, for everything he's done to take Bo's suggestions seriously and now make this program possible. So thanks to both of you, true Californians, and I'm a Carolinian, but I'm grateful for those on the West Coast that help those of us on the East Coast. So thank you very much. So let me see if I can go forward here. So I'm trying to see how I go forward on my.
You should be able to. There you go. Just click your arrow button.
My arrow button.
Yeah, on your keyboard. You're on the second slide now.
Yeah, I've been clicking my arrow. Oh, no, it doesn't seem to move.
If you maybe click down on your mouse.
Oh, it's a mouse.
There
okay,
you go.
I got it. Yeah, that's great.
You got it.
So this very first slide, which I'm showing you, has at the top of it the translation, "O human being, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful." And then it says underneath it, "by the Quran, which is full of wisdom." So what you see in front of you is a picture. This is something that you could not have seen a decade ago. This came out from the book of Sandow Birk called the American Qur'an. And this is the beginning of chapter 36. There are 114 chapters in the Quran. And never before in its history of translation has anyone tried to do it with pictures as the background and the Quran itself as a text amid pictures. So he's really trying to do a visual Quran, or what I call a graphic Quran, with both images of what is being said and a transliteration of what's been already translated in English. So to be very clear, and Sandow Birk himself is clear, he did not do the translation that you see in front of you. He found something that he was able to use text-free without any prohibition. And he used a fellow called Reno. And I'll explain some of who Rodwell is later on. But he took Rodwell's translation, transcribed it in this urban graffiti street letters, and then did these pictures in the background for several of the chapters of the Quran. This one happens to be one of the most important chapters because for anybody who's a Muslim, I won't have to explain this, but anybody who's not a Muslim, it may be obscure. The 36th of the 114 chapters is arguably one of the top 4 or 5 of all the chapters in the Quran, because it's the one that's called Yasin in Arabic, and is always recited at the death of a person. So it's sort of an enabling scripture for both this life and the afterlife. And usually it's translated by just transliterating the 2 Arabic letters, Ya and Sin. But Sandow Birk, has taken a translation of a fellow named Muhammad Asad, who says Yasin is just an abbreviation. It stands for human being, oh, human being. So Sandow Birk is already translating not just Rodwell, but also a later source in his rendition of this page, where he shows what's called the basmala at the top in the name of God, passionate and merciful, but then begins with by the Quran, which is full of wisdom. And you may say, well, why does he use this image? So it's a novel idea, but why does he use this image? Well, because he's saying on the little background, this is from Iowa, in the 114 chapters, he goes through almost all of the states in actually continental America, and I think he excludes Hawaii, but everything else is online. I think even there's one picture that shows Alaska. So this is Iowa, and there you see the train, there you see the cornfield, and there's one line there, 34, which reads, 33, which reads, a sign for them is the dead earth. We bring it to life and bring from it grain which they eat. And so he's doing a kind of pictorial representation of that one line, which sends in as kind of a metonymic representation of the entire surah of the Quran. So to introduce you to Sandow Birk more fully, I thought I would indicate that he didn't do this simply as a gesture of goodwill. He did it because he thought also there might be a market for considering a new version of the Quran. There's no patronage, there's no king or queen or emperor or other authoritarian figure who pays for a Quran to be done in English. It's really the market that determines the sale and use. But the interest of people, both Muslim and non-Muslim, has caused more translations to appear in the past century, that is in the 21st century, than anybody could have imagined. And I'm sorry, in the 20th and now in the 21st century. So what I'm going to do is just give you 3 samples of what I call different sizes of the Quran, which appeal to different leaderships. So the first one, which any of you who've traveled to Turkey will immediately recognize as Izmir title, and it's a beautiful Turkish cover to a translation of the Quran in English, which was made by somebody from India. So even in just sharing with you at the very outset, one image of a Quran translation, I've done the inner page of Sandow Birk, which is 2015. This thing is more like about 2012. It's 3 years earlier, but this is about the 10th or 11th version done by this fellow Wahiduddin Khan, who himself is an Indian Muslim scholar who only recently died at the age of 97. And this is a very small Quran translation, which he did in Delhi, India, which was then printed in English in America and then distributed in Turkey. And I got it at a mosque in Istanbul when I was there 3 years ago. The other version, which is so important for Sandow Birk and for all scholars and many of the people who are just students without being scholars of Islam, is one by a person named Muhammad Asad. You can see his name there at the bottom, Muhammad Asad. And you can see the kind of calligraphy that is in the middle there that's Arabic. And actually it's a representation of the Basmala. The thing at the top says in Arabic, in the name of God, Bismillah. And then it says underneath in English, the message of the Quran, because for Muhammad Asad and for many Muslims, you cannot translate the actual meaning of the Quran. You can only translate its message. Sandow Birk believes you can also not only translate, but illustrate the message. And this is the cover for his book, American Qur'an, artwork by Sandow Birk, but then with a preface by two people who are better known in Islamic studies. Reza Aslan is a popular writer, and Zarinder Gurwal, who teaches at Yale, and Iftikhar Dadi, who's also an Islamic studies scholar at Cornell. So just to summarize for you, what I'm presenting here is really not a transition, but a revolution in a transformation in terms of the number of renditions or copies of the Quran you have in English. 120 or 123 years ago, by the year 1900, there were only 4 translations in English. But by the year 2000, there were 62 more and 7 that were partial. So you had, let's say, close to 70. But in just when I last did my calculation, which was 6 years ago, in 2016, there had been 14 more made already. And I looked at my bookshelf now, and I've got 6 additional ones. So there are at least 50 that have been produced in the first quarter of the 21st century. And I would estimate that there will be 100 more that will be completed by the end of the century. In other words, there'll be one virtually every year. So in the 20th century, there is one translation every other year. By the 21st century, there'll be roughly 3 new translations every year. And why do I pick Sandow Birk? Because I think of his as a unique effort by somebody who is not a Muslim, but somebody who is sympathetic to thinking about religion in a generic sense, including Islam. And I got to meet Sandow Birk after I bought and read and used his book. And I asked him how come there is this difference between the title of his book, which is American Qur'an, and the very first slide I showed you, which is the Quran in practice. So he says, and this is a direct quote from my personal interview with him, the Quran's in the title, but Quran recurs in the text because the Quran is the current name, while Quran, spelled with a Q-U, Quran, is pronounced Qu instead of Qor. Quran is respectful of Islamic history and Muslim preference. So in other words, he tries to market it both in terms of what people might expect if they're not Muslim, and also what those who know Islamic history or are Muslims would want to have. So it's, to answer your question, why do I write about the Quran in English? Because in English, I think Quran is a more representative and more frequently used term than Quran, which refers to the Arabic Quran as an Arabic text and not one that can be translated in any language, including English. So here's an example of the many, many, many instances. What I think of as the most important translation of the Quran that was done in pre-modern times in the 18th century by a man named George Sale. And of course, he titles it the Koran, as almost everybody did until recently. And then he says, commonly called the Al-Quran of Muhammad. Well, that's false, because Muhammad was, in Muslim tradition, Muhammad was the vehicle, but not the source of the Quran. So this is kind of an interpretive way, or a wink, if you will, Sale saying to the reader, well, I know it's supposed to be a holy book, but it's really the Quran, or the saying, the tradition, the revelation of Muhammad. So he makes Muhammad the author, and that Christian bias is there throughout his translation. Broadwell also calls his book the Quran, but he does not hesitate to say it's in a language which could only be revealed. So Rodwell, though a Christian like Sale, admits that the Quran itself has a linguistic and therefore a rhetorical element, which for him sets it apart from other books, including other books in Arabic. I'm not going to talk about all of the translators. I'm going to talk about Yusuf Ali and Sandow Birk. But there's one Ali I have to mention in the same breath with Yusuf Ali, and it's Muhammad Ali, looking like a very traditional scholar with what's called a dadiwala, with a beard and a turban on. And he was one of the first translators in South Asia who made it very popular to think about the Quran in English. This is why his translation looked, the Holy Quran. He called it the Holy Quran, not Koran, with English translation and commentary. And he was a learned scholar, so he's called Maulana Muhammad Ali. He was followed by somebody named Pickthall, who called his the Koran instead of the Quran because he thought that's more popular for English-speaking people. He himself was English, but he translated and transcribed and transferred himself from Christianity into Islam. In other words, he converted. And his name is Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall. I just simply call him Pickthall for short because it's too complicated to talk about a Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall. It's a tongue teaser besides. So his translation came out in 1930. And later, when they republished his translation, the scholars decided it'd be more popular to call it the Koran. So it started out as the Koran and became the Quran, but it's the same book. And here's the same guy looking very British, very dapper, Marmaduke William Pickthall, who became Marmaduke Muhammad Pickthall. And here's Yusuf Ali, the guy whom I think of as the iconic great translator. So he follows in the fifth sets of Muhammad Ali, and he's about the same time as Pickthall. And he also was an English civil servant. And so he, as Kevin said in the introduction, he's a British civil servant who then in his spare time, not only mastered Arabic, but translated the Quran. And his book was called from its very beginning, The Meaning of the Holy Quran. He never used the term Koran, but he did translate the word Allah, the name Allah, which is used throughout to call God in Arabic. He translated throughout as God. And that itself is another subject of controversy. Can you translate Allah? And if so, can you translate Allah as God? And we can talk about that later if you like. Muhammad Asad, whom I showed earlier, presented his book in 1980. It's been reprinted several times. And here it is in its full-blown form. First published in 1980 from Gibraltar, 2003 from Saudi Arabia. And here, of course, is the irony of ironies, is this book is published or printed from Saudi Arabia, but you can't buy it in Saudi Arabia. And the answer is because the translator, although he's a devout Muslim, was considered to have strayed too far from making the Quran into an understandable book in English and accepting English itself as a vehicle for expressing Islamic truths. This is a page from the introduction to Asad, not in English, but the Arabic version of it. So you can see, like Sandow Birk, he believes that you can do art, not pictographic art as Sandow Birk does, but you can see the art form of the top, which is giving the title and some information about the text. In the middle is the text itself, and below is some more commentary. Just to show you a few pictures, this is what Muhammad Asad looked like. This is what he looked like when he was young, when he was converted as a German, Austrian, Jewish scholar who became a Muslim and then went to Arabia. And that's when he came to Arabia. He still looks more Germanic than Arab, despite the headdress. And then he was very much old. He went back to Western dress. And here he is after he died in 1992, they put out a stamp from him in Pakistan calling it Allama Muhammad Asad. Now, I'm not going to talk about him a lot, but since this is a California audience, I have to say that there is one Californian besides Sandow Birk who deserves special memory and special attention when you talk about translating the Quran into English. And that's a man named Thomas Cleary. I suspect some people have heard of Thomas Cleary, but they may have heard of him as somebody who translated the Lotus Sutra or the I Ching or any of the other Chinese or Asian classics of the many 80. This is a man who's a PhD from Harvard, but also got a law degree from Berkeley, and spent most of his life translating instead of commenting on major scriptures. And at one point in the 1990s, he decided that he had to translate part of the Quran. It was so tough that he decided to just do part of it. So in 1993, he did the essential Koran. Notice the spelling Koran, because he wants it to appeal to an English-speaking audience. But then he says in the small print, an introductory selection of readings from the Koran. So like Sandow Birk, he tries to have it both ways, using both the spellings Koran and Quran in order to highlight what he's doing. Later, he got such a good response, Thomas Cleary did, from his brief excerpted rendition of the Quran, that he decided to do a full-length translation of the entire Quran, which he called the Quran, a New Translation, and did it with this kind of Arabic print, which is also Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, around a circle, and then with a kind of a crisscross in the middle. And he did this in 2004. Now, that is a background to tell you about Sandow Birk. And I'm not going to be able in a few minutes, because I want to limit my talk to just 35 minutes and have Q&A for the rest. I can't do full justice to Sandow Birk. So I've given you his website there. I suspect some of you who are Californians have gone to the Catherine Clark Gallery, and you may have seen some of his early work before it became finalized and published as a book in 2015. Some of the early panels that he did from this work that are still on sale. Many of them are sold, but still some of them are still residual sale items at the Catherine Clark Art Gallery. But you can also go online if you don't want to the gallery. You can go to sandowbirk.com/paintings and you can see some of these works. I can't tell you how much I've learned from him in my own thinking about the Quran. I'll try and tell you a little bit about it. The first thing is that he actually did something which nobody else had ever done. When I say nobody else, other people have transliterated the Quran, other people have transcribed it, but nobody has hand transcribed it. He hand transcribed the entire Quran using Islamic traditions of calligraphy, but using this urban graffiti street letters as his preferred script. He knew he'd get in trouble if he tried to translate using something that was protected by as a copyright, as was Yusuf Ali. I mean, not Yusuf Ali, as was Muhammad Pickthall, and also as was Muhammad Assad. So he picked someone else named Rodwell, who's not protected by copyright. In other words, is in the public venue and public interest, and he could do it. So he used copyright-free English translations from several authors, but mostly from Rodwell. Although I mentioned to, he also uses some from Muhammad Assad, but not enough to be charged with overriding the copyright that protects Assad. But what he did beyond hand transcribing and beyond using already existing English translations is he illuminated the whole thing with 21st century American life and political as well as social events. Now, I don't have enough time, and even if I had enough time, I wouldn't have enough space to show you this huge book of his, which I only carry around when I have somebody else who can help me carry it, because it's such a heavy book. It's several pounds, 13, 14 pounds heavy. It's a 427-page book and has 230 illuminated table-sized pages, and has reference to nearly all the states in the continental United States. It's simply a magnificent, but also a humongous production by this talented artist, Sandow Birk. And I think he follows what I would call the guidelines, and people could disagree with me, but this is what I've summarized in one slide as the qualities for a good translation. I think there are three criteria. The first is accuracy. It has to reflect what is there in the original source, but it also has to be clear. So it's not only accurate and accessible, but it's also clear to somebody who's reading it in another language. And this third one is the one that really gets some people very upset or very challenged and upset, is rhyme. If you're translating poetry, it's difficult to translate poetry into prose and have it still be not only accurate and clear, but also meaningful to somebody who can read it and get a sense of what the original was. And I use the word sense because I myself have been influenced by other translators, none more so than W.H. Auden, who translated, some of you may know, Dag Hammarskjöld's reflections called Markings, which were written, they were very personal reflections. You know, Hammarskjöld, who was the first head of the United Nations and was killed in a plane crash in the 1950s over West Africa. Hammarskjöld did reflections in his book, which is, I think, published posthumously, called Markings, but it was translated from the Swedish by W.H. Auden, who quipped at the beginning, "I did not know a word of Swedish, and so proceeded sense by sense." And I think for any of you who never read it, you can go online and find it. But the translation he did of Markings is itself just an astonishing piece of work. But what I like about it was the sense by sense practice. In other words, even if you don't know a language, if you're not native to it, you have to use an informant, you do a very measured feeling, a kind of engagement of the text that's sense by sense. So that means there are 5 dimensions to a scriptural text. There's the text itself, but also the context in which it was revealed or which it was disclosed or written down. But then there's something else that is the oral and visual, that is how it sounds and how it looks. And then there's what's called the theological part of it, the mental part, that is how you interpret it and what kind of commentary you attach to the text itself. Now, I would argue that all these things, the textual, contextual, the oral and visual, the theological and commentary, are important. But I think it's the fifth that too often gets dominated. So I could if we had a whole hour or 2 hours, probably be more like needed to give you a sense of commentaries on the Quran. They range over from the early 8th century all the way up to the 21st century of commentaries, but everyone has a certain theological viewpoint which they read into the text, and the text itself often exceeds in its meaning and its layers of meaning what's in that particular commentary. And what's left out in almost all the commentaries from the 8th century to the 21st century is how it sounds, how the Quran itself sounds, or how it looks. And what Sandow Birk has tried to do is to suggest how it might sound. He doesn't do a reading of it out loud, but you can read his text and it's very accessible. But then you can see how he's lifted out certain verses and made the sounding of it also part of how it appears and how one takes into account what you see as well as what you hear in thinking about the Quran. So Muhammad Asad, whom Sandow Birk uses and others use very frequently, although they can't reproduce the whole of it because it's covered by copyright. He says in the introduction to his book, The Message of the Quran, which was first published in 1980, mine is an attempt, and this is quite a claim, perhaps the first attempt at a really idiomatic explanatory rendition of the Quranic message into a European language. You note on the screen that I put in bright red letters, message, because he accents message, because he then goes on to say, I can't claim to translate the Quran in the sense in which, say, Plato or Shakespeare, both of whom he's read, and you can see this in his commentary, that he's well read in European and ancient philosophy, as well as in the Quran and Quranic commentaries. Unlike any other book, he says, its meaning and its linguistic presentation form one unbreakable whole. So in the last resort, this is just summarizing 3 points from his long introduction. In the last resort, the Quran is unique and untranslatable. So even though he's offering you in a very big book a translation, he's saying at the end of the introduction of the translation, the Quran is unique, and I'm sorry, folks, untranslatable. And then he adds, only its message can be rendered in English. So he calls his book The Message of the Quran. The reason I like Cleary is not only because he's a venturesome person, I think the most venturesome translator in the 21st century before Sandow Birk, and I rate the two of them together. He says in his early version, the 1993 prelude to the full translation he does in 2004, that the most extraordinary ambition is to produce an English version that's intentionally designed for reading out loud or reading aloud, so you can absorb and reflect on it, because this is the characteristic of the Quran. Quran itself doesn't mean just revelation, it means recitation. It means to speak, to announce, to sound out the words that have been given in the Muslim tradition to an angel called Gabriel, and through Gabriel to Muhammad, and through Muhammad to the whole of that community that became Muslim from the 7th century to the 21st. So Cleary accents what I think is very important, not only the accessibility, but the poetic pleasure of the text in English. So there must be something that really rhymes in the heart and not just in the head. There must be more than fidelity to the prosaic message of its Arabic original. So, coming back to Sandow Birk, he notes that he adapts techniques and stylistic devices from Arabic and Persian painting and albums. And if I were doing a larger art type presentation, I could show you how he has used signatures, emblems, aspects of traditional art, Arabic, Persian, also Turkish, in the way he projects his own images. But they're American images with a kind of Islamic touch to them. So one of them is this book that opens with a folio on the initial or first chapter of the Quran. So this wonderful sense of a kind of Persian manuscript painting, but it just says, instead of saying Al-Fatiha, which it is in Arabic, it says opening in English. And then it gives you in bright red what's called the Basmala, which is in every one of the chapters except one, in 113 of the 114 chapters, the Basmala, which means in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. And what he's done is he's taken the word M and put a cross through it to emphasize how important it is in the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful. So he accents the M And then he does this nice rendition of the whole text itself in this urban graffiti street letters. I keep saying that because everything is related to urban life, even when it's rustic, as in that first picture I showed you from the Iowa plains. But this, of course, is a picture looking down from the top at New York, and the opening is the opening into a large city, and thinking about the city as itself and opening to the rest of the Quran. This is the one I shared with you earlier, just to show you how the city looks different from the plain, but both of them have this wonderful arch looking. Here the arch is sort of in the deeper background. Here it's in the foreground, but it always has a kind of stately feeling to it, whether it's rustic or urban. And I want to conclude. I could say much more about Sandow Birk, but I want to conclude by saying he picks certain parts of the Quran out when he's commenting throughout the book for different illustrations. But at the end, he says something really unusual. He takes a single verse from the Quran. This is chapter 2. I haven't said anything about what the Quran itself contains, but let's just say that in the 114 chapters, that the early ones are very long, and they constitute maybe up to about 50 or 55. And the last half of them, roughly from, let's say, 56 on to 114, the last 70 of the chapters are very short. So what he does, he takes this one verse from a chapter, which is the longest chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah, and it has, this is in English, it's 279, but it has the total in English, it has a total of 286 verses. So he's picking just one of the 286 verses of chapter 2, and he's picking it and has this translation in English, which reads, "Woe to those who write scripture with their own hands and then say, this is from God, to sell it for a paltry price or for a petty price. Woe to them because of what their own hands have written, and woe to them of what they've earned." I think what he's trying to say is, I'm not doing this for money. This is somewhere between a quotation of the Quran and a self-confession, or if you will, a self-abasement, saying, I've done this, but I'm not doing it just for money, even though others have done it, and plenty of others have done it for money. I'm doing this because of my devotion to wanting to make the word of the Quran, which is in Arabic, accessible also in English. So he says, in parentheses, in a medallion in the middle, the book is finished. And then this is a translation of a phrase that every Muslim knows and every Muslim says many times a day, Alhamdulillah. So Alhamdulillah means Alhamd, praise, Allah, praise to Allah, or in English, praise be to God. And then just to show you that he's aware of the Arabic, he has Allah in Arabic written beneath. So he has a quote from the Quran. He has a signature of his own completion of the book with a characteristic invocation of God, praise be to God. And then he has in another medallion the name Allah in Arabic. And then down at the bottom, he says, if you can read this, I think I did it here so you can see it. The book is finished, praise be to God, 2 medallions on either side, signaturing that he's saying this is the book you can open and close, and then the name Allah beneath it. But then he says, copied and illuminated in Los Angeles, Paris, Puerto Rico, and Lisbon. So when I saw him, I've had the pleasure of not only me and talking with him, but also of discussing with him why he did certain things. So I said, why did you mention Puerto Rico? That isn't a usual place where you think of the Quran being worked on. He looked at me and said, Bruce, didn't you realize that I was working on this thing for over 10 years? And I would just take it with me when I go on a plane to go somewhere. And the thing I like to do most when I fly, or even when I stay at home, is surf. So they have great surfing in some of the islands in Puerto Rico. And I spent some of my best days on beaches in San Juan and elsewhere. And that's where I did some transcriptions. And the same thing is true for Lisbon, Los Angeles, and Paris. In fact, he says, I got the whole idea when I was surfing in Ireland, in Dublin. He said, I had a day when, and of course, any of you have been to Ireland, or if you haven't, you know there's rainy weather over there, very rainy, and very frequently rainy days. So he said, there's one day when it's too rainy, I couldn't go surfing. So I said to a friend, what should I do? And the guy said, well, you're really interested in illustrations. You ought to go to the Chester Beatty it's a great library in Dublin. So he went there in Dublin. He saw some Mamluk manuscripts of the Quran that had been done in Arabic, but they also been erased and printed over. And he said, if they could do this in the 16th century, I can do it in the 21st century. So he was really inspired by some of his off days, you should say, when he was surfing, going to some place to surf, but couldn't surf. He would do his research on the Quran, and he came up with this idea of doing a kind of complete illuminated Quran or American Qur'an. And this is what came out as the American Qur'an copied and illuminated in Los Angeles, Paris, Puerto Rico, and Lisbon, but also in other places, including Dublin, Ireland. So that's it.
I'm back. So if you want to close the slideshow, I think you could just do stop share, and then we'll both be back big on the screen. Or I can, there you go. Perfect. That was really fascinating. I took a whole bunch of notes, and I just want to start by saying it was really interesting to get the kind of survey of all of the various people and players who have done different translations of the Quran and the use of, Koran or Quran, and why they, titled their translations the way they did. And I have some questions about Sandow Birk's original, like why of doing this book. And I know in the beginning you said about the market. There's a new market for this, but what was he thinking? What is the market for his translation, and how was it received when the American Qur'an came out and was available?
Well, I should say, thank you for the question, Kevin. Well, as I said before, let me repeat, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present to the Book Club of California. I like the term BC, but I like the term BCC better. So the reason why Sandow told me that he did this, because I asked him, he said, I had lots of Muslim friends who were as appalled by 9/11 as other non-Muslim Americans, and maybe even more appalled because they saw their own religion as having been misunderstood and now as having been misrepresented at a huge level in the public sphere. And he said, when I travel around the world, as he does as an artist and also as a surfer, he's met many Muslims, and he said, I don't recognize them in the people who were the bombers of 9/11, the people who bombed the Trade Center and the people who bombed the Pentagon, despite some claims from certain representatives that the Pentagon wasn't bombed. I think we have to say that Marjorie Taylor Greene is wrong on that, as well as other things. So he himself, he was very clear that he felt bad about this total wave of anti-Muslim feeling. Of course, it became anti-Asian feeling. Some people who looked Asian or looked like Muslim Sikhs, Sardarjis who wear turbans, were also hurt in the aftermath of the wrath about 9/11. So Sandow Birk is a very conscientious and clear-minded person, as well as a professional artist. And so what he wanted to do was to figure out some way that he could make another statement about Islam. And he was trying to do this when he was in Dublin and surfing there. He had in mind that he might do a couple of images that reflect positive views of Islam, but he hadn't thought of doing the whole of the Quran. But as I said, that the moment of the road to Damascus for him was the road from Dublin.
It all started in Dublin.
It all started in Dublin, not Damascus. And so the way he tells the story is that he then became engrossed in this project. He had to figure out where he could get a copyright-free version that he could use as main text with some additions from others, including Muhammad Asad. But then became absorbed with it, and it took him, a decade. So let's say he started around 2003-04, and the book isn't published till 2015. So this is a long trek. And I think some of the folios that are shown in the Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco that were sold early on were his effort to make enough money to do the whole thing. I remember if one goes online and looks at I think if I'm not mistaken, it's Pittsburgh, where he did a show and he says, I hope I'm going to be able to complete all this and put it in a book, but I have to sell some of the folios in order to get enough money to put the book out. So he did this strange thing of projecting a whole book, but selling folios of certain chapters, which he knew would be especially evocative. And from the proceeds of that, being able, and then he fortunately got W.W. Norton, which is a major publisher, W.W. Norton, to agree to underwrite the cost of it. And so between some of the folios that he sold and the front end money from Norton, he was able to publish this book. But it remains a collector's item. In other words, this has not become a bestseller book because it's just not a book that people can handle easily. But I've had people, I have a copy in my living room, I have people come in and when they see it, they say, where did this come from? Why did anybody ever imagine doing a book of this size? And then they start to read it and they actually get entranced by the pictures, which is of course what he wanted to do. He wanted to have people who are not Muslim, people who've never seen a Quran, look at this book and say, well, that's a strange picture of a Mexican eatery, or that's a strange picture of the moon, both of which are in there, as well as pictures of Afghanistan and pictures of New York and Los Angeles. So it's the images on this, it's the side which draws you to the center instead of the center which pushes you out. It's a centripetal instead of a centrifugal force that he puts out in the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything about the book is kind of engaging and draws you in. The art, some people have commented about, the beautiful artwork. Well, you called it urban or urban art, urban life, street art,
urban graffitis. I think his term, in one of the interviews he gave about why did he pick this thing, he said, I wanted to do something that was urban and graffiti. So I decided to use urban graffiti street letters.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And it brings in like a whole new audience who were interested in that. And I'm guessing there has not been a version of the Quran, anything like that, anything illustrated in that manner before. Is that right? Has it?
Oh yeah, certainly it's right. It's also right that he did get objections. So I didn't answer the second part of your question.
Yeah.
When he first went to the University of Michigan, he had some people who were very hostile in the audience and said, you can't do this. First of all, you're not a Muslim, and secondly, you're not respectful of the Quran because you're using images. And before the person could finish the answer, another person who was a veiled Muslim woman, and that really gives you a lot of authority when you're a veiled Muslim woman in a kind of collective group. She got up in the audience and said, well, I never imagined I could learn something from a book like this, but I've learned about an A, B, C, and D. And she went off on different things that she found that she liked from the book. So that kind of answered the question. Is for some Muslims, it's still not acceptable to translate the Quran into any language. And to transliterate it is just a secondary transgression. The first transgression is to think you can translate it. The second one is to transcribe what's already been translated. But Sandow Birk wanted, I think he was committed. In fact, I know from my conversations with him, he was committed to putting out a product that would at least give another view, a healthier, holier, wholesome, and better view of Islam to the general public in America.
Yeah, actually, perfect timing, because Deborah just put something up in the Q&A, which is on my list to ask you to elaborate on more, which was that you mentioned that the Quran can't be translated. Only the meaning, right, can be translated. Right? I think that's what you said. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that means? And is that the reason why there are hundreds of potential new translations on the horizon for the Quran? You would think by now it's been translated, right?
Yeah. So let me give you an example, which is it's going to take a couple minutes, but I think you'll get it from this. So every translation of the Quran has to wrestle with the shortest possible phrase, which comes at the beginning, as I said, of 113 of the 114 chapters, called Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So I just gave it to you in Arabic, and I suspect you haven't heard that in Arabic before.
No, I have not.
But you did hear a rhyme in Rahman and Rahim, right?
Yeah, there's a melody there. Yep.
So there's a certain rah-rah to it. If I can be just a little bit comical, a certain rah-rah, Rahman, Rahim. Well, it actually is because it comes from the same root in Arabic. So one of the things that fascinated me from 30 years ago, from 1990, when I first became interested in translating the Quran, is why didn't people have that echo of the rhyme in English?
Mm.
And I asked people about it. They said, well, because you can't translate the Arabic. And I said, but you can give some echo of the Arabic. You maybe not render it literally, but you give it echo. And so the echo was to do Rahman Rahim with some of the same rooted words in English. So the English that my friend used was all merciful, ever merciful, or full of mercy, ever merciful. So he used mercy twice. Sandow Birk uses compassion and merciful, which is nice, but it's not accurate. I mean, I think he wouldn't mind my criticizing, saying that as wonderful as his rendition is in the artwork and the heart that went with the artwork, it's not rhythmical in English to say, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. There's a certain rhyme, but it doesn't echo the root scheme in the Arabic of Rah, Rah, Rahman Rahim. So I think it, and then the one that I like better than, or I think they're equally good, but I prefer, is the name of God, full of compassion, ever compassionate. So the compassion is there twice. The first one means you have it, and the second one means you exercise it.
Mm.
Full of compassion means I got it in my heart. Ever compassion means I show it to others. So I came across this translation after having worked on the Quran for 30 years. And I read countless other translations. And a friend of mine who's a Mauritanian Muslim imam, that is to say, he's a recognized scholar in Islam. He's now a professor at Yale University named Shaukat Turawa. And when Shaukat heard mine, he said, Bruce, you're right. That's the only one. And he's done several translations and he's changed it all now to in the name of God, either the compassionate, or full of compassion, ever compassionate. Because he says, you're absolutely right. And until we did this, which was less than 10 years ago, it never was in English.
Mm.
So that's why you keep coming back to this. It's like a jewel that you want to shine, but you never get the full light.
Right. Yeah. And the light changes, right? Or
The light change.
Yeah. Yeah. What about illustrated versions of the Quran?
They're all illustrated with borderline art that's Arabic or Persian or Turkish. Or somebody mentioned something about Urdu. Somebody went online and said that the people who took the words of the Quran literally because they have a copy in English or Urdu. Urdu has a very complicated relationship because the Urdu translations of the Quran were done from the Persian, and they weren't done until the 19th century. So they developed as Urdu itself developed as a language. So many of the people I know who are Pakistanis have actually learned the Arabic, and then they learn Urdu as a kind of commentary on the Arabic. The Urdu translation is a commentary on the Arabic. So for instance, I taught a class on the Quran maybe 15 years ago, and there was a Pakistani in my class who was himself what's called a Hafiz, Hafiz, and that means somebody who's memorized the whole Quran.
Mm.
So I just said to him, why are you taking this class? You memorized it all. Oh, he said, Professor Lawrence, I not only memorized it in Arabic, he said, I can quote you several of these commentaries in Urdu. Well, I said, I'm even more puzzled. Why are you? He said, because I can't understand it in English.
Mm.
So the English of it is still a wall. It's still a barrier for a lot of people to be able to get to have. So I've been actually working for another decade with a friend of mine who's a Pakistani Muslim scholar with an Oxford DPhil or PhD. And the two of us are trying to do something that's more like a verse translation that would have some echo of the original without trespassing on the Arabic purity of it.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So back to the American Quran, and the book itself. Do you know how many copies were made? And because you said it's collectible, right? It wasn't a bestseller necessarily, but I'm sure it's in a limited edition. It's how many were actually produced, and where can they be found other than your home?
Oh no, I mean you could go online and get this, and some people are just amazed at how cheap it is. I haven't checked recently, Kevin, but I would say that if you went online and looked for either under Sandow Birk or Kevin Quran, or Kevin Qur'an, or Kevin Qur'an. You see, you've changed your name now.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll take it.
Someone says the book lists for $100, but actually you can get it on Amazon for something like, I know I got it for a nephew of mine a couple of years ago for $65.
Mm.
So you get the whole thing online from Amazon, and I think it may be $68 or $69 by now, but I don't think I'm sure it's less than 100.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's just beautiful. I mean, the slides you showed of different spreads and pages it's just beautiful.
And that's just a fraction of it. It's just a fraction of what you could see or what you would see if you looked at the whole of it.
So there are a couple of questions. I think you might even have the chat open or the Q&A open. And there's that first question that came in from Dee about Thomas Jefferson. Did you want to says an important subject matter, especially for Americans to understand. What's your take on Thomas Jefferson's interest in the Quran? Was that unusual for Enlightenment thinkers or trendy?
Unusual for his time. First of all, the very first slide I showed, if you flip back on my whole thing, but you don't need to do this. But when I said the very first translation from 1736 was by a man named George Sale,
Mm-hmm.
the Koran, or underneath in parentheses, the El Quran of Muhammad. I think there was the 6th or 7th slide that I showed. But this is what I didn't indicate when I talked about Sales is that in his lifetime, but then beyond his lifetime, in the 18th and 19th centuries, I could be wrong on this one, but I think I'm pretty close to being right, that until Yusuf Ali in the 1930s, that Sales was the best-selling version of the Quran because it had become a classic. It's something that he worked on very hard. Yes, he did have a Christian bias because he called it the El Quran of Muhammad, and for Muslims, it's not Muhammad as the origin of it. Muhammad is the messenger or conduit of it, but not the origin. The origin is Allah or the angel Gabriel who's speaking on behalf of Allah. So there's a sense in which Jefferson prized it as a law-giving book, because Jefferson, as you may know, he had a library that was burnt down. Anybody who's a Jefferson scholar knows that he had a library, but only a few people know he had a library that was burnt down. And one of the things that has been written about, there's been a book, and I've forgotten the name of the woman, is a woman who wrote a book called Jefferson's Quran. But in it, she says that he considered Sale's translation so important that after his first library burnt down, he went and bought a second copy of Sale so he could have that in his new library. So the answer is that, and what Jefferson liked about it was, even though there are some creedal points in the Quran, it obviously is a believer's text, and it's speaking from one person as a believer of the Prophet Muhammad to other people whom he wants to believe the same as he does in the nature of the universe, in the nature of prophecy, in the nature of destiny. All the things that occupy people in the Abrahamic tradition and a lot of other religions are there in the Quran. But it also has law. It also has some points of law and regulating society and speaking about the collective good. So Jefferson, as a good Unitarian, respected the idea that Muhammad was not only a prophet, but a lawgiver. And I think he saw in the Quran a book, which I'm sure, I've not seen it, but I'm sure that if one had a copy of his second version, because the first version was burnt, that you would find, as he did for the New Testament, he underlined the ones in red that were ethical. So the parts of the parts, and some of those are, by the way, appealing to Sandow Birk. If I can connect Thomas Jefferson and Sandow Birk, I don't think Sandow Birk would mind, and it's too late for Thomas Jefferson to object, that they both looked at the ethical message of the Quran as a core. So yes, you can take or leave or doubt or accept what is said about God and the universe and the prophets and the ultimate destiny of the world. But in everyday life and what you're supposed to do in terms of behavior and outlook, and especially in kindness and justice, there is a lot that could be underlined by Thomas Jefferson and also used by Sandow Birk.
Yeah, so there's another great comment in here. I think Kevin Ahern put in here a link. I haven't opened it up yet. Thomas Jefferson Encyclopedia Quran for more information on that. But Deborah is also asking if you, and I'm wondering this too, how did this all start for you? what was your interest in the Quran and your whole history of studies? Like, how were you drawn to this as a topic of study, and then as an author to write books about it?
Accident.
What was that?
Accident.
Really?
It was an accident. So I think actually, I have a good friend who's a very famous lawyer who has retired from Duke, and I asked him how he got to be such a great lawyer and how he wrote so many important opinions and why he'd been able to travel all around the world. And he said serendipity, being in the right place at the right time. So for me, the right place was Princeton. The right time was when I was a freshman, and I walked into a class on Islamic philosophy, and I never knew there was such a thing as Islamic philosophy. But the person who convinced me to take the class was a Jewish classmate of mine and a good friend. And he said, they have the greatest Islamic philosopher was a guy named Maimonides. He was Jewish. And I thought, boy, anything that can translate from Islam to Judaism via a Spanish philosopher named Maimonides is something I want to pursue. So that was the accident of having a hallmate my first year at Princeton in 1958, who convinced me to take an Islamic philosophy class. And that kind of unraveled to my taking Arabic and then thinking, but to be honest, I always thought I was going to go in the diplomatic corps. You know, if I couldn't be a good diplomat, I could be a bad lawyer, but I would at least do one of those two things. And it was really as a result of a kind of strange experience of being in Washington, D.C. in the 60s and Kennedy's assassination that I kind of was looking for a firmer mooring in life. And I went to divinity school up at Harvard, and I took a couple of courses in the yard with a fellow named Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And Smith said to me, you know Arabic better than most people who are studying it, who come from the Middle East. Why don't you look at the Quran? And so from this Harvard professor in the 60s, I started to read the Quran, and I found it entirely engaging. But I didn't find it something that I would ever write on. I just found it something as a background. Until the 1990s, like Sandow Birk and like others in the 1990s, I began to feel there was so much antipathy to Islam, and the only way to kind of counter it, or at least put it in perspective, was to look at the Quran more closely. And I was invited by a London publisher to do a book on the Quran, a biography, and reluctantly I accepted because I thought I didn't know enough to do it. But that book took me 5 years to write, and that sort of cemented my interest in the Quran. And from there, I went on to write this other book, the Quran. So I have two books. I have a third translation of the Quran, which will come out in another year, probably 2024, that I'm doing with Rafi Habib. But the other two books, to answer Deborah's question, one was done because I went for a long walk with my wife, and she said, you've got to do it. I was teetering, and I wasn't sure I could really spend 5 years writing a book on the Quran. She says, you've been working with it your whole life. Why don't you work on it for the next few years? So my wife really convinced me. The publisher offered it, but my wife was the one who said, yes, it's worth doing, and I'll help you do it, which she did, because her Arabic is even better. It's much better than mine. So she actually went through a lot of the passages with me.
Well, we know she's a gem. She got you on the Zoom.
She got me on Zoom. So that's the serendipity of my life, is to have met the right woman and have had the right guide from the time I was young.
Yeah, I'm going to put in the chat for everybody the link to your website, and also information about the Quran in English, a biography, in case people are interested in that. They could click those links and kind of find out a little bit more about you.
Sure.
Which I think would be great. We are at the top of the hour, a little after, about 5 minutes after. So I'm going to just check to see if there's any other questions here that we haven't answered, that we might want to answer. I think you looked at it. I think we've got all the questions in the Q&A in the chat. I don't have any in my email either. So maybe we can wrap up here and see if there's any last comments that you want to make or share, observations or thoughts.
Yeah, my observation, and I didn't say it, but the questions really prompt me to say it, is that in every place where I've gone, someone said to me, if you were in a prison, or if you were in a desert island, you were a Robinson Crusoe experience, and you could just pick only one version in English of the Quran, you didn't have access to the Arabic, of the ones that are out there now, which one would you pick? And it was a
Yeah.
really great question. I hope I don't have that stranded experience on a desert island, but if I did, and I had with me just this one book, I'm holding this up. I don't have a paperback version of it, but what I'm holding up is the Essential Koran by Thomas Cleary. I think it's a gift from the heart. First of all, I don't think my baggage would allow me to cover Sandow Birk. If I had a big baggage, it would be Sandow Birk. But if I had a small bag, if I had just a pocket bag, it would be Thomas Cleary, The Essential Koran, The Heart of Islam. I think this is a book with such interesting choices of language and choices of verses and the commentary, which involves Buddhist and Hindu, as well as Christian and Jewish scripture and in its evaluation of the Quran. I would say that Thomas Cleary, if I had to pick my one island read or prison cell read, if I was either in a cell or on an island and I had only one book for eternity that was in English on the Quran, it would be Thomas Cleary.
Wow, yeah, that's a question I hadn't thought to ask. That's so interesting. And now everybody knows that's the one to get if you're going to be stranded on an island or incarcerated somewhere.
So if I were on this program 2 years from now, I would say, I hope that I've just produced the one that you would read.
Ah, yes.
Rafi Habib, this scholar, who I could just mention in 2 words, who is not a scholar of the Quran or of Islam. He's a devout Muslim, but he's a poet. What I said about W.H. Auden translating the markings of Dag Hammarskjöld is what I say is that I have learned a lot about the inner meaning or subtle meanings or layered meanings of the Quran in working with Rafi, because sometimes we'll come across a verse where I'll read in Arabic, and often with my wife also present, because she reads at a different level with an understanding beyond than what Rafi and I get from it. So when we read a passage, the 2 or 3 of us, and sometimes his wife joins, or 4 of us, you get a collective feeling that there's a way to short circuit all the misunderstanding or the logjam of history, but it's really hard to do. And so it's taken us almost a decade. We started in 2012. It's taken more than a decade, 2012, and now we're in 2023, to begin to think about how do you hear these words. So it's not a question of getting it right from Arabic to English. It's a question of having it sing in English.
Right.
And getting the tune and the song and the lyrics is really tough.
Yeah, yeah, and that was part of your presentation about the senses and how that sometimes is trumped, right, in the actual translation. Well, the
I tried to use that word Trump, but at least it's eliminated.
Eliminated, superseded. There we go.
Superseded by.
But people can go to your website for information on your new book. You'll have that there.
Oh yeah,
right?
It's in my website. Sure.
Yeah.
BruceLawrence.com.
And again, that's in the chat there. So, and if you came to this webinar this evening, or if you registered and didn't show up, you'll still get an email tomorrow with those links. So you don't have to take them out of the chat or worry about copying them down. They'll be in the email kind of recap that we send to everybody tomorrow with summary of, what you were here for and some links to follow up if you want to know more about Bruce. But that's it. I think we're now 10 minutes after the hour. So I'm gonna wind up by saying thank you so much to our presenter, Bruce Bennett Lawrence. It's really been great getting to know you and working with you on this presentation and having you here tonight for a book club audience. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Kevin, thank you. You were as accurate as you were generous, and I appreciate both your generosity and your accuracy.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you everyone out there for attending this Book Club of California program. It's great to have you with us again virtually here in the new year. I hope that you will join us for our next program. It's the exhibition opening From the Printed Work of Joe Mora. That's going to be next week, Monday, January 30th at 6 p.m., an hour later. And it's going to be at 6 p.m. because it's both a live in-person program that we will also be presenting on Zoom. So you can join us in person here at the book club, or you can be on Zoom with us for the exhibition and opening of From the Printed Work of Joe Mora. Peter Hiller, who is author, historian, and the Joe Mora collection curator for the Monterey History and Art Association, will be discussing the creative career of Joe Mora and his various works on paper, which will be here on display at the book club. You can register for that program online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in any of the weekly emails that you might be getting from the book club. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope that you'll join us for the next Book Club of California program. Be well and take care of yourself. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kevin.
Good night.